Yes, it's me behind this mask. Welcome to Talking Maine with the Bowtie Boys. I'm Tom Saviello, and I have my special friend of a long time, the Pigeon Man. And he's not the congressman or the legislator, Scott Landry.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you. Short notice, but I know Scott races pigeons, and I thought it would kind of be a neat show to have him come on and talk about his pigeons and how he got into pigeon racing and what it's all about. So, Scott, how did you get into frickin' pigeon racing?
It wasn't hard.
Wasn't hard.
When I was a child, we had moved to Massachusetts. And while there, I found a pigeon that was hurt. So I took some screens off my parents' house they didn't know about, nailed them together, and put this pigeon in there. And got him healthy, and he was coming along. And there was this old German-Jewish fellow in Southbridge, where we were living, who the back of his store, he had a retail clothing store, was full of birds. He had parrots, he had minor birds, he had all kinds of birds. And every day kids would troop in after school and look at his birds. And I asked him about the pigeon. Well, that was a mistake because he was into pigeons. He had hundreds of homing pigeons and fancy pigeons. So he gave me a couple birds. And with pigeons, you're all right if you have one, but if you get two, you get a lot more. So from there, it just grew.
What happened to the pigeon you made better? Did you let him go?
Finally, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. But then I got into the domestic pigeons.
So you started a long time ago doing this?
Yeah, I was probably 10.
Wow.
So
did you start racing at 10 too?
No, and I didn't start racing till I moved to Wilton about 35 years ago.
So how many pigeons did you have as a kid? Your parents must have been real excited about the screens you took down.
Well, they weren't real thrilled, but then I had to build a coop, and then a bigger coop, and a bigger coop. And so through my pigeons, I also learned carpentry because I had to do a lot of building. And I remember one time I needed a new building, and my father was a buddy with the National Guard, and they needed a training exercise, and somebody had a 8x10 shed they wanted to move off their property. So here comes the National Guard bringing a shed in.
Oh, gee. Wow.
It's not what you know, it's who you know.
So how many pigeons did you have as a kid?
Anywhere from 10 to 50.
Really?
Yeah.
And you didn't race them, you just had them as pets?
Pets, yeah.
Oh.
And, so I had to work to buy feed to feed them, which was always something. They eat grains, layer pellets is what I feed in the winter, but when we race the pigeons, we feed a mixture of high protein grains. But then you begin the week on barley, then you move them up, you change the load when you come towards the race day.
So let's talk about the pigeons you brought here, and then let's talk about racing pigeons. Because you got some interesting things with these guys.
Yeah, here I've got 2 racing pigeons and a fancy bird, a show bird. I'll show you that. This.
And you're showing to this camera right there.
This is a racing homer. They're a beautiful specimen. He's a blue bar, or what we call a pencil. He has these little ticks in here. This is a male bird. He won a race for me this year. He's a young bird. And when they're about a week old, we put a band on their leg. And on this band has got their number, the national organization, the club, and the year they were born. So anyone who finds a bird with a band can go to one of the national organizations, find them on the internet, and find out exactly who owned the bird. Now, this bird is his grandfather was purchased by a friend of mine, and he paid tens of thousands of dollars for the father to this. And he took that bird and mated it to a bird that I had that had won a 300-mile race here. So with pigeons, it's always, you're trying to put best to best because it's a study in genetics. Here, this bird's he's got excellent bloodlines, excellent history, and he's in excellent shape. You can see the color in his neck. Now pigeons, when you go into a pigeon loft, the whole loft will be covered with this white powder. It's called bloom. It's a protein that they shed from their feathers. And a lot of people wear masks all the time in pigeon coops. I'm foolish. I don't all the time. I probably should now that I'm used to them. But when I'm away from my pigeons for about 3 weeks, if I happen to go somewhere, I can tell the difference in my breathing capacity.
Oh, really?
So
So
I
just
say this, I should pay attention to
So
what I
it's
say.
a small powder. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it? Why do they give it off? Is it?
It's just what, I don't know why, but
Huh.
now this guy, his grandfather was real good. Now he's a Van Dennebiel, bred by a gentleman in Holland named Gabby Van Dennebiel. Now here's another homing pigeon. This is another male bird. He's a silver. We call him a silver or a mealy, and very powerful, long wing. You look at the wings when you're racing pigeons. You look at this wing, and there are 10 primary feathers. The primaries are these 10, and the secondaries are here. Now, when they're born, they'll have and about 30 days old, they'll have a full wing. But then they start dropping. They'll drop this feather, then this one, and they'll grow back in, of course. But when they've dropped this third feather, they're old enough to start training, which is about 3 months. And once you start training them, you put them in the basket, you take them a few miles, and let them go. You do it repetitively. Just keep getting them used to being in the basket, taken away, and released. This guy is a Deveranth. It's a strain that was developed in Holland, in Belgium. And he hasn't done anything spectacular, but he's from very good blood, so I'll use him. Pigeons are amazing. I know a lot of people have commented this week on something they've seen on the news. A pigeon just sold, a Belgian pigeon sold to somebody in China for, I think it was 1.6 million pounds, or $1.9 million. So that's a lot of money for a pigeon. And that pigeon will be put with another very expensive pigeon and bred. And they'll sell the youngsters off of that for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So what's so special about this guy? He wins all the races he's in, or?
He was a big national winner in Belgium. Belgium, Holland, China are the real hotbeds. They have races with prizes of up to $1 million.
Oh, wow.
And they do these weekly. It used to be the big thing, well, the way we race is we have different competitors released from one point, and they all go to their individual lofts, so the birds are scattered. But what's developing are these one loft races where they'll have a monstrous loft, a couple 100 feet long with thousands of pigeons in it, and they train them and race them, and they'll race them every week. And the winners of those races win a lot of money. The Chinese love to bet on pigeons.
So the loft would be like, I might own a pigeon in that loft. You would own a pigeon in that loft.
Yes.
JP would own a pigeon. Andre would. Victor would. And so when they race, that pigeon who wins out of his home. They all live together.
Yes.
They all have that homing place.
Yeah.
They get taken 500 miles away and released.
Yeah.
The first one back is the winner.
Exactly. And many times, the one thing I didn't show you, many of them will land at the same time. And so they'll have average speeds. They'll do it a cumulative speed. This is an older bird. He's got a yellow band. This is last year's bird. But this here, there's a microchip in here. So when he comes home and hits the landing board, the chip records the exact time it is. So you know exactly how many miles and yards it is from liberation to your home. And you know how many seconds it took him to come home. So it's just a simple math calculation to get yards per minute.
And that's what you win on in your races, because that's what would be, so you might be the furthest one away, and your bird doesn't come home until 2 days later, but the fact that he actually flew faster than everybody.
Yes. And in Maine, there are about 10 of us who compete, and all the way from Winterport, Hancock, Searsport, Charleston, Vassalboro, Wiscasset, Rumford, Farmington, Litchfield. So we're all competing, but we're 70 miles apart. So depending on where the point is, whether you're long or short, how the wind is, what direction the wind is coming from, will often determine, well, most of the time determine who's going to win. But in order to win, you have to have your birds in condition at the right time. And this year, in the middle of the season, I had a real bad race. I lost 19 out of 23 birds.
Lost meaning they didn't come home.
They didn't come home.
Wow.
And I should have known better. I was so busy doing other things that I didn't notice. One day when I was training them, I only went to strong. It was kind of warm. They came back. They're all breathing real hard. And I should have immediately paid attention to the fact they had some respiratory problem. Because when you crowd anything, when you have too many animals or too many people in one place, bad things happen, as we know with the COVID. So it happens with the pigeons. So I shipped the pigeons, and so then I immediately put them on. You have to be your own druggist too. I put them on amoxicillin for a week, for 10 days. And I did better the next week, but then I won the next 5 races because I had my birds in shape. And so you're constantly watching them. You're watching the droppings. You're watching the feathers. You're watching how you feed them. You put different medications or vitamins or electrolytes in the water.
Give them steroids? So they're
No steroids.
No steroids.
No,
Big pigeon.
But there is in the United and all over the country, all over the world, they do test the winners of the big races for steroids.
No kidding. Oh,
Yeah, well, hey, where there's money, there's cheating.
yeah, yeah. So how much could you win in a race? A buck? A couple bucks?
Around here, we might win. I won, I think, $600 for winning a club money race. But each week we have little pools. But the big race is a couple $100,000.
Really?
And if you were in Belgium or China especially, up to $1 million on races.
Jeez. So how many do you have?
I probably got about 150 pigeons.
Now, do you hatch your own?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, they mate for life.
Really?
But they do fool around.
Oh.
So the only way you know for sure who's who is if they're in separate pens. But they lay 2 eggs, and 19 days later the eggs will hatch. And within a month the young birds are flying. And within 3 months you're training them. And by 4 to 5 months you're racing them.
Wow. Wow. So when you start to train them, what else do you say you take them a little couple miles away and fly home?
Yeah.
Is that that's all you do to them? Just every day or every other day?
Well, once they come out of the loft, you get them acclimated to the loft. They make sure they go in and out on their own. Rule of thumb for me is when the birds are flying around the house and they take off and go for an hour, I know they're ready to train.
So you actually let them right out of the box and they come back because the food is here, and they get to get associated with this as home.
Yeah, they know where their home is, and there are many theories, but I think magnetism has got a lot to do with the Earth's magnetic field. I noticed, I was telling you earlier, since the 70s or the 80s when I started racing, if you started with 50 young birds, you'd end up with 75% of them. But now you're lucky to end up with 25%. And I've got to think that it's all the radio towers and microwave towers. Cornell University used to do a lot of research on pigeons. And they had one point where they liberated their birds that was near a Navy communications tower. They'd let the birds go at that location, and they would circle and circle and circle, and always had terrible losses from there. And finally, someone smartened up and said, well, why don't we ask the Navy to turn off the transmitter while we do this? Which they did, and immediately the birds were coming home, circling a few times and heading home immediately. So there's...
So when you moved from Wilton to Farmington, did you have to do away with your whole crew?
I left the coop in Wilton, built a new one here in Farmington. But there were a few birds that I had to retrain and race, which worked. You lose a few. The old birds would go back to the old loft, hang around, then finally come back.
Really? So they knew to come back. Huh.
Yeah, but you know, that was after being in the new loft for 6 months and letting them raise babies.
Oh, so that became home for them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, young birds, you fly just to the coop. Old birds is a whole different science, because we race young birds from August through October. Old birds we race from April through June. And in the spring, the birds are breeding, so you use different tactics. One is, there are two methods primarily. The natural system, where you fly them to eggs and babies, or the widowhood system, where you separate the males and females all week long. The day of the race, you show the female to the male, and they start getting together. And before they do anything, consummate anything, you take the male and throw him in the basket and ship him to the race. And so
oh, man.
He's kind of eager to come home.
I guess so.
Yeah, and so but it's a different strategy. And some birds, when you fly on the natural system, the hens will fly best after they've been setting on eggs for 10 days. Some do better with day-old babies. Some males with week-old babies. So you have to watch them all the time. You have to pay attention.
So what do they? You know, we all see the robins get worms. What do you feed babies?
Pigeons are unique in that they produce a milky substance in their crop. It's called pigeon milk. Unique, funny saying. But they feed their babies. Pigeons are unique also in that, have you ever seen a chicken drink? They put their beak in, they lift their head up. Well, pigeons don't. They put their head in and drink just like a horse does. So they're a little different, but they feed their own young this milk for about 7 or 8 days, and then they regurgitate food into their crops.
Wow, wow. So take me through a race day. So we're going to have a race. So what would you do to prepare, and then how would you release them, and then how would you know who won?
Well, on race day starts the day after the last race. When they come home from a race, typically you might medicate them a little bit because they've been with other birds. You might want to
make sure there's no disease with them.
Yeah, you know, hit them with a canker and some other medicine. Then towards the end of the week, you put them on vitamins, but during the week, you change the food load. You start on Monday with a barley, to more of a depurative to clean them out. And then you just, increase the proteins or carbs, depending on how far they're going to fly. On race day, you gather them up, take them to the club. And at the club, which happens to be at my house, we scan the bands into the computer. So we know all of the birds who are entered. We know their chip numbers. We put them on the truck. The driver takes them to the race point, liberates the next morning. We usually have 2 races, a half an hour apart. And we just sit and wait for them to come home. And when they come home, if they come home alone, they just zoom right in oftentimes. But if they drag somebody else's birds, they'll circle around. So you might want to take a bird. I've got show birds, so I can use these. And you throw one of these that doesn't fly very well. And that pulls your birds down away from the other flock. Now, I'll diverge a little bit. With pigeons, there are people who raise pigeons to eat, pigeons to show, and pigeons to race. These are the racing pigeons. This is my favorite show bird. This is an oriental frill. They were developed in Turkey several hundred years ago, and they are strictly a show pigeon. And in a show pigeon, you breed for different characteristics. You want 10 white flights. This one's got 1 white secondary. You want the ribbon tail. You want the white body without a lot of dirty marks around it. And they have virtually no beak. So these can't feed their own young. So I take their eggs and put them under homers or other birds. Now this particular breed, where he's an oriental frill, he has to have a frill, has to have a crest, the short beak. There's supposed to be a line beneath the eye from the beak to the crest. He's also got to have booted feet, feathered feet, and he also doesn't have to do that. but you know, they're a beautiful pigeon.
Yeah.
And the lacing on this is a little bit too dark, but it's very hard to raise. With these, half the eggs are fertile, half of them hatch, half of them make it a month.
Oh, wow.
Half of them make it 6 months, and then you got to find out if they're any good. And the width, this guy's a little narrow in the beak. He's a young bird. Next year his nose will be wider, so he'll be a good pigeon. This is going to be a male bird, a cock bird. And as I was saying, when these guys come home, you take something like this and throw it. He won't fly, and that'll pull the homers down. After the homers come home, we report our speeds or our times, put them in the computer, and figure out who wins the race.
So the showbirds now, okay, so I got you. So you're taking them out, and you bring them to the common release point. They come out, they fly home.
Yeah.
When they go into the house, you tag them in. They go into my house or wherever it is.
They chip in.
And then you go and do the average speed, and whoever had the best speed coming home wins the race.
Yeah.
Wow. And so you have had examples where you put 23 birds out and only 5 came home?
Yeah.
How about the other side of the number, you know, where you had almost all of them come home?
Oh, that happens. Usually it depends how many birds you have in a race. The guy who puts in 20 birds, more often than not, is going to do better than the guy who puts in 5.
I got you, yeah.
Because you've got some pull. But the winner is out front, so.
Wow.
And, you know, it depends on how healthy your birds are and the wind, if the wind's in your favor. In Maine, we don't like to race into an east wind because it kills them. And we have one of the toughest race courses in the country because we've got the coastal effect, we've got the winds. The weather in the state is never the same everywhere.
Yeah, wait 5 minutes.
Yeah. And for instance, I've got friends who live in Florida, in the Gulf area, Brooksville, down that way. They have a lot of pigeon people have moved from New Jersey and New York all over the country to this Unit 10 development in northwestern Florida, where they have hundreds of people who race, just like in Belgium. And down there, a second will make a difference. You'll have 2,000 pigeons come in to this one little area, and throwing the dropper is important as training the birds. You want them to come in and zoom right into the loft. Down there, it's pretty relatively flat land. They fly with prevailing winds, so they're doing speeds of 2,000, 2,200 yards a minute, which is 1760 is 60 miles an hour. So they're doing 70 and 80 miles an hour.
Jeez.
But they don't have the obstacles that we do. They do have hawks down there too, which we also have hawks. With your young birds, when they're first getting out, hawks are a real problem. As they get older, if the hawks are chasing my birds around, I don't train them as much because they
win. The hawks will win at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Wow. So the showbird, what do you do with the showbird? Do you fly them too? Or
No,
you
we just take them to competitions. There's none this year because of
COVID,
the shutdowns. But typically I go to Massachusetts or New York, or the big show is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania every year I go to. And there'll be 10 or 15 guys with the same breed that each breed has a standard, and you try to breed the birds to replicate the standard, to come as close to perfection.
So if the standard is, say, the beak is 2 millimeters long, you want your beak to be 2 millimeters
Yes,
long.
and you want them 8 inches high instead of 10 inches high. You want the markings to be right, and you want them to be healthy. And the problem, one thing with shows is lately a lot of diseases hit. There's an adenovirus, which they call a young bird virus. Birds will be healthy, you bring them home, and half of them will be dead.
No kidding.
It only affects young birds. And they do have a vaccine for it that I vaccinate all my pigeons.
Wow. Dr. Scott.
Yeah, for 2 or 3 things we vaccinate.
Wow. So how long will a pigeon last?
Racing, 3 or 4 years, depends how lucky they are. We used to race them longer, but breeding, the homers you can breed up to 9 or 10 years. The longest I've kept one was 20 years.
20 years?
Yeah.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah.
But didn't fly all that time.
No, he flew for about 8 years, though. He was a good flyer and a good breeder.
Now, if they lose one of their feathers, does that pretty much do it for them?
No, they molt their feathers systematically, from that first flight out to the 10th. And you don't really want to ship them when they're missing the 9th and 10th flight. But that's the end of the season, and that's when the long races are. So
That can make a big difference in whether they get back or not.
Yeah.
So what's some of your best pigeon stories?
One of my biggest thrills with homing pigeons was I won what we call the New England Open. It was, there were something like 4,000 pigeons in it. It was a 400-mile race from New York State. And I beat a friend of mine he lived outside of Brookline, Mass, and I won this race. And that weekend I won 3 races. My birds won 3 races. My birds were in prime condition, and they would just clicking. And after I won the race, I was talking with a friend, and somebody wanted the pigeon, so it ended up going to Taiwan. I sold it for $2,000.
Oh, geez.
And it wasn't a pigeon that I really liked a lot because it was real flighty, and you'd go in the loft and it would freak out and fly in your face. And I said, well, it can go to Taiwan. And another great accomplishment was we used to fly before the borders were so tough to get across, we'd fly out of Canada because we had a combine from New Hampshire and Maine, and there was a 500-mile point in Verner, Ontario, that was pretty much even for everybody. Everybody was within 30 or 40 miles.
Oh, okay. Good.
Where if we came from the southwest, we had a 60-mile difference. Well, I put this race together with friends of mine from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And it was from Verner, Ontario. Everybody could put in 3 birds. And we had pigeons from 17 states. And in the top 10, the first 10 pigeons were from 9 different states.
Wow.
So it was just, that 500-mile radius was perfect for all these different lofts. I didn't win it, but my accomplishment was planning and putting it together and logistically getting crates to all the flyers and then get them all shipped to this race station.
Cool. So what's the difference between them and the homing pigeon that's extinct?
That was a passenger pigeon.
Passenger pigeon.
That was a dove.
Oh,
These, they're all descended initially from the rock dove, Columbia livia, which you see flying around town. If I mate these 2 fancy birds, a fancy and a homer together, at some point you're going to get birds that look like the original. They will throw back to the original blue bar Columbia livia.
And then the difference between those and the common pigeon?
It's all about genetics. If you find 2 common pigeons with, say you have 2 blues and one of them has a white feather, pretty soon you can cross them and breed them and get more white. and then you see one with a little feather here, you breed and you develop that.
And since it's only a 19-day breeding schedule, you can pretty well breed quite a few during the year to move the genetics along.
In a few years you can really drastically change a breed or even develop a new breed that will breed consistently.
And the ones that are the common pigeon out there, could you train them to be homing pigeons?
They can go 30 or 40 miles, but
Wow.
you'll lose them after a while.
Cool.
And the homers are bred just for that. Throughout history, homing pigeons have been important as carrying messages, especially during World War I, World War II. They've saved thousands of lives. And in fact, there are a few of them that are mounted in the Smithsonian who have saved hundreds of lives.
Because they take them out with them, see who the troops are coming, put the message on them and send them. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, this is great. These are interesting. Now I even learned something today.
Well, good.
I think I'm going to call this pigeon Scotty. That one, this guy. He's got the little green in him.
Yeah, I get a little green sometimes myself.
Looks a lot like you.
Yeah.
I think he could run for the legislature.
Oh, geez.
Probably win. Probably beat you.
do better.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Talkin' Maine. And yes, it is me. See you later.